All right, we're back. Marc Surdyka is back. Round 4 of the Debunking series. Mark, how are you doing?
Doing well, Chris. Thank you for having me back on the podcast.
Of course. Let's chat about what's been going on since we talked last. We finally met in person, which was great.
Yeah, your second time in Bend, Oregon, right?
Yeah, I was there one night when I initially moved up to Washington, and then, went back to see you and the E3 crew. It was phenomenal.
So context for the listeners, Tony Camella, the man behind the curtain, lives in Bend, Oregon. So Nicole, my wife, and I flew up to Bend. Chris drove to Bend and took some pictures, filmed some content, ate some food, played some pickleball and some spike ball.
That's right. Do we want to discuss the outcomes of either of those?
Let's just say that I think Nicole and I won in spike ball, which is pretty good. That was my second time playing. And then
Yeah.
pickleball, we got one game in there.
Did y'all win one?
Yeah, we did that first. We played 2 days of pickleball. Remember that last game? And we're like, it's the last one that matters anyway.
Oh, the first day. Yeah, that's true. Y'all were on a high from winning spike ball, but it was a great time. And I am bummed that y'all beat us at spike. It wasn't ideal conditions, but neither of us had ideal conditions, so that's not a good excuse.
I mean, having a hip replacement isn't ideal condition, so
That's a fact.
yeah, and you guys are coming to LA in end of November, beginning of December. So I'm sure we'll get down on some more pickleball. I might see if my dad wants to come up. My dad lives a few hours away. I'll get him on my team, or I'll get him on
That's
Nicole's team.
Given how now you know how I play, will your dad still slap me at pickleball?
Yeah, easy. Super easy. Yeah, for sure.
Got it. Okay. What else is new? Last time we chatted, I think you were about to wrap up the improv.
Yeah, I wrapped it up. It was good. It was a good 6 weeks. I probably won't do. There's like 4 levels for this particular group. Like level 2 is developing characters, and then just like building off of what we did for the past 6 weeks, and then level 3 builds off of that. Level 4, but yeah, it was good. But it's a time commitment. Like just for me to drive there, it's 3 hours on a Sunday. Drive back, it takes up like 4 hours every Sunday. And I try to minimize my driving in LA. So
Understandable.
But yeah, it was good. What about you?
What's been going on? Nothing really. I'm going to Oregon. I'm going to Portland this upcoming weekend for Scott Morrison's course, who we just had on recently on his Sloptimal loading course. I think Eric Mitt is going to film it, so that'll be exciting. That's pretty much it. Excited to come to LA, play some pickle, do some stuff, and then we're also going to fly out to the Northeast, which is exciting.
Oh, like us, like for CSM, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful sunny Boston in February.
Yeah. Well, last year it was in San Diego and it was just dreary and raining the whole time. So who knows? It may actually be good weather, but I highly doubt it.
Yeah, I was actually going to drive down for the day, and then like some of the freeways were flooded, and I was like, I don't want to be stuck on the highway just to go there for a day and then come back. So
yeah, totally. Okay, you ready to talk about the primary topic for today?
Butt stuff.
Butts, that's right. Yeah. We're going to talk about all things glutes. And by the time this episode comes out, the YouTube video will already be out on all things glutes and gluteal amnesia. So, Mark, do you want to chat so we have a good starting point? Give us a little base on the glutes. How many muscles are there? What do they do? And then we'll chat kind of about this primary debunking, a lot of things that are being said and thought. But what's going on with the glutes?
Yeah, so just to your point, the YouTube video will be released prior to this podcast episode being released, or we're recording this before the video goes out. But the nice thing about that is for almost all of our YouTube videos, we have associated blogs on the website, and the blogs always have links to the research. So, rather than having Chris link every single article in the show notes, you can go to the blog, and then whatever you're looking for, if I say something specifically, you can, click that exact phrase on the blog, and it'll take you to the PubMed article. So all of that is there. The other thing that I want to preface this with is that, I'm going to talk about the glutes. We're going to talk about some of these studies, but none of this is, at least as it relates to glute training, is a perfect science. I'm not saying that I'm an expert in muscle hypertrophy, but I think there's a lot that we don't know. And if anybody is super confident in the best exercise or the best training modality for the glutes, I'd be a little bit skeptical, because there's a lot that we don't know. And with research, we get more questions a lot of the times rather than just answers. So just wanted to start with that. So glutes, hopefully most of the listeners know gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. So gluteus maximus, largest muscle in the body. It's the most superficial. When you're looking at somebody's glutes, you're primarily looking at the gluteus maximus. Origin, pretty broad origin: sacrum, coccyx, sacrotuberous ligament, thoracolumbar fascia, and part of the ilium, or the pelvis. And then insertion, iliotibial band, the IT band, and the gluteal tuberosity of the femur. Now, this is important because sometimes in research, the gluteus maximus is divided into different divisions or portions. As an example, one of the articles that we're going to talk about, they kind of broke up the gluteus maximus into an upper, middle, and lower portion as they were measuring the cross-sectional area, as it relates to muscle growth for hypertrophy. Now, there's a really well-known study by Delp in 1999, Delp et al., variation of rotation moment arms with hip flexion, and they split up the glute max into 6 compartments because they were trying to determine, the different rotational moment arms of that muscle. You'll also see it often, and this is probably used more kind of anatomically and functionally, divided into just an upper and a lower portions, due to the glute max's attachments to the IT band and the gluteal tuberosity of the femur. And the reason that's important is that everybody knows that the glute max contributes to hip extension, right? It's a strong hip extender, external rotation, and then it can contribute to both abduction and adduction, so adduction, based on those, different upper and kind of lower attachments there. Another thing is that oftentimes when we're looking at textbooks or apps, the muscle actions are based on anatomical position. So if you look at an app or a textbook and it says hip extension, external rotation, and hip abduction, usually those are referencing anatomical position just being you standing upright with your arms down by your side. Now, if we go back to that paper by Delp, what they did, and this is a modeling study, right? What they did is they modeled the actions of these different glute muscles and the different components or compartments of the glute muscles at 0 degrees of hip flexion and at 90 degrees of hip flexion. And as an example, for the glute max, most of the fibers of the glute max actually became hip internal rotators at 90 degrees of hip flexion, except for kind of the most posterior compartments, right? So we're not going to get too in depth with some of this stuff because we're going to describe it as it relates to the glute med as well. But just knowing that, once again, there's a lot that we don't know. And there have been other, studies as well trying to model some of these muscles, and it's difficult just because of how expansive it is. But as an example, right, the brachialis, which is a muscle in your, elbow, is an elbow flexor. It doesn't matter the position of your forearm. It doesn't matter the position of your arm. Like your brachialis is always an elbow flexor. Glute max, that action might change depending on, the position of your hip as it relates to internal and external rotation. Gluteus medius, there's actually a really nice paper, Gottschalk, 1989. You can, look at that paper, or we've done a blog and a YouTube video about the gluteus medius before. Fan-shaped muscle. This one is partially kind of superficial at the upper glute area. Origin, once again, I'll just say the ilium, insertion, greater trochanter, right? That bony prominence on the kind of side of your leg, side of your hip there. I'll say the main actions are hip abduction and then stabilizing the pelvis in the sense that, when you're standing on a single leg, it kind of helps to maintain that single leg balance, that, that somewhat level pelvis. So you're not having like a Trendelenburg gait. And then same thing in this Gottschalk paper, they describe different compartments of the gluteus medius. So an anterior compartment, a middle compartment, a posterior compartment. They describe different actions. In the Delp paper, they talk about the different actions of those compartments as well. For the purpose of, this podcast, for the purpose of the blog and the video, just primarily describing it as hip abductor, in an open chain or like a non-weight bearing manner. And then still doing hip abduction, but relatively, kind of stabilizing that pelvis on a single leg. And then gluteus minimus. So, pretty similar to glute med, but just smaller, not palpable, not visible.
Why do you think the glutes have become so popular over the past 3, 5, whatever years?
As it relates to rehab, or as it relates to aesthetics or fitness, or?
Let's stick with rehab and fitness.
I mean, I think the glutes have always been popular. Honestly, if you look back at research 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and still today, there's research looking at like, hey, you have patellofemoral pain, you got to strengthen the glutes, or hey, you have dynamic knee valgus and it's contributing to your risk of an ACL rupture. Hey, strengthen the glutes because it's going to take you out of the dynamic knee valgus. So I don't know if it's new, maybe with the advent of social media, because it's just so much more visible to people. Maybe that's why it seems more popular. I mean, maybe every topic seems more popular. But I would say from like a research perspective, it's always been something that's been, looked at pretty extensively as it relates to back pain, hip pain, knee pain, even like ankle pain, like, oh, you got an ankle problem? Make sure you train your glutes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's start diving into some of these common misconceptions because there's quite a few. And then the latter half of this discussion will probably be more practical takeaways and recommendations for actually training the glutes. So let's start number 1. You need to activate your glutes every day by doing activation drills.
Yeah, I'm not really a fan. And some of these I took from, YouTube videos or social media posts or just things that I've heard in the past. And I'm not a fan of anything that requires you to do an exercise daily. If you are ambulatory, obviously some individuals listening might not be ambulatory from a, walking perspective, but the only exercise that you really need to do every day is walk, right? Like if you believe in evolution, like we're designed to walk and walk a lot. But other than that, I don't think we need to do core exercises or glute exercises or any other exercise daily. And, some of the arguments that I quickly gave, because I actually didn't want this to be a big component of the video and the blog. But if you look at a lot of training studies, and we're talking about the glutes, if you look at glute training studies, often they're done in untrained subjects. And these subjects are generally university students. And oftentimes university students are the ones who are probably sitting a good part of the day, whether they're in their classroom or on their phone or on their computer. And with a very basic, like 2 times per week strength training program that's not super comprehensive, these individuals are able to get stronger and grow their glutes. So it really calls into question, like, if these people who are relatively sedentary, obviously they're probably, they're healthy, but if they're relatively sedentary and they can do a basic training program and they're untrained and they can, get stronger and bigger glutes, why is it necessary to do daily activation drills? And, if anybody listening is really familiar with the research, there is some research. It's actually based out of USC looking at daily glute exercises. For example, there's a study in 2016 where they have participants do an hour of glute isometrics daily for a week. So it's 3 times a day, 20 minutes per day. I think I don't remember the exact protocol, but it's an hour. It's like, like a fire hydrant, maybe like a clamshell and something else, but an hour of isometrics every day. And at the end of the week, they have increased corticomotor excitability. And they did a more recent study. But we have to be very careful with these types of studies in terms of making assumptions or jumping to conclusions and saying that, like, because this showed this, does it actually mean that, longitudinally over the long term, are you going to get stronger? Is that going to contribute to more hypertrophy? Is that going to reduce the risk of injury? Like, does it lead to any specific outcomes? And I think sometimes we take, what we might call mechanistic research and then, take what are seemingly logical conclusions. But if we were to actually do, the appropriate trials, it might not pan out in that research.
Can you imagine doing 60 minutes of glute isometrics every day?
I do it every day. I mean, that's right. I try to keep those buns tight.
I don't know if you listened to this. It was a PT Inquest episode a while back, but they were talking about some type of, I don't remember what the exact topic it was, but Megan, one of the co-hosts, saying she once had a patient that would do seated clamshells in the shower every day. And just the visual of that killed me. I was dying listening to that in the gym. Can you imagine? Just water pouring down on you, sitting there.
That could be like a music video or something.
100%.
I don't know. So, you're putting some. Now I'm thinking of, like, I don't know if you know Natalie Imbruglia. I think the song is called "Torn," lying naked on the floor. Like, anyways, yeah, music video. You're doing clamshells, water pouring down on you. I know you said seated, but
either one.
You could do. Okay. Next one.
Sitting turns off your glutes. You mentioned it a little bit, but what's wrong with this?
So for some of the stuff, like, I'm not going to argue against that. If you're sedentary and you sit a lot, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that your glutes might be a little bit weaker and might be a little bit smaller than someone who's more active. Like, that's a pretty reasonable thing to assume. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do anything inherently special. It doesn't mean that we have to label your glutes as being turned off. It just means that if you want your glutes to be a little bit stronger, maybe a little bit bigger, and you sit a lot and you don't do a lot, you can just be a little bit more active, right? Like, the solution is, if the problem is you're not very active, the solution is be a little bit more active. But it doesn't have to be turned into some kind of pathology of your glutes turning off. Like, how come other muscles don't turn off? Or how come if you sleep for 7 to 9 hours, you don't wake up with all of your muscles turned off? I just have a hard time understanding that rationale, right? And, like, if your glutes were truly turned off, you wouldn't be able to stand up, right? Or you'd have a really difficult time standing up. Like, maybe you have other muscles compensate, but yeah, I don't understand it.
Yeah, true lack of a glute contraction, any type of glute contraction would have to be like a severed, all the motor nerves going into the glutes, right? Other than that, they have to be in some level of contraction if you're standing, like you said, or else
Yeah, I
you
mean, you
go
have other
down.
redundant like hip extensors and your knee extensors, and like, maybe you could get by, like, but it'd be pretty obvious. And once again, if the theoretical problem is, hey, sitting causes some problem with your glutes, like, sure, just be more active, but you don't have to do. Once again, it goes back to, doesn't mean you have to do any daily activation drills. It doesn't mean you have to. Sitting causes anterior pelvic tilt, which is we're going to get into. It's just, maybe sit a little bit less.
You just mentioned it. Sitting causes anterior pelvic tilt. Is that true? It doesn't matter.
No. And did a whole YouTube video on this, a whole blog on this, a lot of research on that. So research showing sitting time doesn't correlate with, your anterior pelvic tilt, like your standing anterior pelvic tilt. Your anterior pelvic tilt isn't related to your hip extension range of motion. So like statically, meaning like a Thomas test where you're lying on your back and you're lowering one leg down toward the ground, or dynamically, like for a sprinter, someone running. So you can't predict how someone is going to move based on their static standing posture. And anterior pelvic tilt also isn't correlated with your glute strength. So it's just another thing that doesn't really matter. And if somebody wanted to stretch their hip flexors because it feels good, they can, but you don't need to stretch your hip flexors to train your glutes. It goes back to the training studies. They'll take these untrained subjects and then just train the glutes, and the glutes work. And you don't have to do anything. They're not assessing their posture. They're not assessing their hip flexion range of motion. They're just training the glutes. And someone might use an anecdote of a particular person or posture. And like, we could use similar anecdotes like, okay, well, let's look at sprinters. And there's some sprinters with pretty significant anterior pelvic tilts, but they also got, really big glutes. And they're also really fast runners. So their glutes are working fine. Or another good example is like someone who's a bikini competitor who trains their glutes all the time, but they're also posing, in a pretty like extreme anterior pelvic tilt. But we wouldn't argue that their glutes are off because that's probably something that they're training pretty extensively. So yeah, sitting doesn't cause anterior pelvic tilt, and anterior pelvic tilt isn't related to your hip extension range of motion or your glute strength. So it doesn't matter.
Same thing for gymnastics and belly dancers and all these other positions where there are these extremes of extended positions and anterior pelvic tilt, but there's also so much force and necessity of those glutes during those sports and performances that, yeah. You always need to feel your glutes during glute-based exercises.
Yeah, so I took this from a video, but this is something that when I was working in the clinic, I would see a lot in the sense of like, hey, do a squat. Like someone would ask a patient to do a squat and go, where do you feel that? And if the patient didn't immediately say in their glutes, the therapist would say like, okay, tap your glutes, like squeeze your glutes. And it's really hard to feel your glutes with a bodyweight squat or several bodyweight squats, especially in that like stretched position at the bottom of the squat. Standing, I can stand here and squeeze my glutes and I feel my glutes, but in the bottom of a squat, it's just really hard to feel just trying to like, mentally, consciously contract the glutes in that stretched position. But something that we see online is that someone will have a patient do a 5-second single leg bridge and then say, if you don't feel your glutes during this 5-second single leg bridge, well, you have gluteal amnesia, right? Or they're not active enough. And it's such a leap. One reason they might not feel their glutes is because the exercise is too easy. Once again, I could do 20 bodyweight squats. I'm not going to feel my glutes because it's not hard enough for me to really get them working at a, high enough level, high enough effort for me to feel them working. Like, why would they kick in? They don't, or kick in that hard where I'm feeling them work. It's not hard enough. Or, maybe it's just a technique thing. You have someone do an exercise maybe they've never done before for the first time, and you quickly tell them, hey, do this for 5 seconds, and they don't feel their glutes, and it's automatically once again, like pathological versus like, hey, let's try this again, but let's move your shin, or hey, try to tuck your pelvis this way, or hey, move your leg around. You don't even give them that opportunity. It's just, well, your glutes are turned off, or they're, partially asleep, and these other muscles are taking over. And yeah, so it might be too easy. You might just need to change the technique. Like I said, I've seen it with bodyweight squats. I've seen it with walking, right? Like, hey, when you're walking, you should feel your glutes working, or you should feel your abs working. And you absolutely shouldn't, because they're not working hard enough for you to feel them working, right? Unless you have, you're severely like deconditioned, or you have maybe some other kind of issues going on. When you're walking, you shouldn't be consciously contracting your glutes or feeling your glutes working. Like, you just walk. And then the other thing is that you don't really need to put too much stock in short-term sensations. And I'll come back to this, but we have really good papers by Vygotsky and colleagues. He has 2 different papers really reviewing the literature as it relates to EMG findings, and that the EMG findings don't predict longitudinal changes in strength or hypertrophy. So we make these like jumps to say that, oh, we see high EMG activity, which is actually a misnomer. It should be related to the EMG amplitude, but we take this like, EMG research and say, well, this is the best exercise for hypertrophy, or this is the best exercise for strength. And that's not always the case. And I keep saying this, but one of the papers that we're going to discuss that compared squats to hip thrusts, they had the participants rate the sensation, like, hey, which ones do you feel the glutes, working more? Like, describe how you're feeling it. And they felt it more in the hip thrusts, which I would say, like, I do, and a lot of people probably feel the hip thrust working more, but that didn't actually lead to different long-term outcomes. So even though they felt the hip thrusts working their glutes more, it didn't mean that their glutes grew more, over the course of the study.
And from a like cueing and coaching and performance based task, if it's a lot of research now is showing external cueing and like task specific goals makes more sense than this kind of internal focused attention. So I feel like there are definitely reasons to like have sensation or to feel things during certain activities, but a lot of times if it's performance or like outcome driven, then they probably shouldn't be overly analyzing the sensations that's going on in their body.
Yeah, an example would be like a power lifter, right? They're not thinking about squeezing their glutes at the bottom of a squat. It's just move the weight from A to B and then back from B to A. Like, that's it. Rather than, hey, what muscles are working during this? They know that their glutes are working because they're doing their 1 rep max or 2 rep max or 3 rep max, and like everything has to contract in order to get that weight up. Maybe I'm being, I don't know if like cynical is the word, but maybe we don't have enough real problems that we just create these other issues of always worrying about our posture and glutes being asleep. Like, we're not worried about predators attacking us in our sleep. Most of us aren't worried about starvation. We're not worried about, natural disasters most of the time. So we're sitting around looking in the mirror, worried about our anterior pelvic tilt and whether our glutes are asleep. But, I don't know.
I have a new patient in the clinic that she told me she uses the booty band or whatever, the thicker ones around her legs every time she squats, barbell back squats and front squats and deadlifts, because she doesn't feel her left glute. So it just seems we haven't addressed that, but we also just tried barbell back squatting without it, and she said it was completely fine. So it is just, do we have to add more and more things to overcomplicate an exercise, or to just like try to attain a sensory experience where you may not necessarily need it, or it doesn't matter?
Yeah, and as we'll talk about, you can do the squat, you can do the deadlift, and then you can do a hip abduction exercise. You don't have to combine them.
Weak glutes will cause back pain or leg pain.
Yeah, this is a common thing that we hear, but it's a chicken or egg scenario, right? Unless we have like really good prospective research looking at this. Did somebody develop back pain because they have weak glutes, or do they have weak glutes because they have back pain, right? Like if somebody has back pain, they're relatively sedentary or inactive, or they're in pain, so they can't do as much activity. As we already mentioned, it makes sense that your glutes would be a little bit weaker. And then we do see research that you can have increased activity of the glutes, likely as a way to compensate for, weakened muscles. So let's say that you have hip OA or whatever condition, and so you have a painful hip, and because you have a painful hip, you probably don't load it as much, and because you don't load it as much, your glutes will probably get weaker. To try to compensate for that weakness, you'll try to recruit that glute or those glutes at a higher level per step than somebody who maybe, doesn't have pain and doesn't have that significant weakness. So we can actually see increased activity of the glutes in individuals who have pain. So yeah, we can't say weak glutes will cause back or leg pain. And I want to point out that despite all of these things, you can still train your glutes. I still recommend training your glutes. I still recommend doing squats and deadlifts and hip thrusts and hip abduction exercises. And you can do it because you want your glutes to be stronger, you want your glutes to be bigger, or because you have back pain, or because you have knee pain, or whatever it may be. We just don't have to pathologize these things and yeah, just make someone feel. I mean, we make people feel bad about certain characteristics, or we make them catastrophize or worry. Like, you can train the glutes without having to think about any of this stuff. That's how I think about it. I don't know if you have that same perspective.
Yeah, it goes back to that initial debunking episode we had on core stability and over pathologizing core and certain abdominal muscles, and this over fixation of certain positions and postures and muscle groups. But yeah, you're not arguing against training something. It's just the belief surrounding it, the frequency in which you need to do it, the kind of the nocibic language surrounding it. So I'm on the same page.
Like, let me just, I'm going to quickly go through each one of these, right? You need to activate your glutes every day by doing activation drills. Maybe a patient comes to me with that belief, and we'll have this long conversation. We don't need to get into the nuance because I talk about this on every podcast episode that we talk about together. But I can say, hey, actually, it turns out you could train your glutes twice a week and they're going to get bigger and stronger, and you don't have to do daily activation drills. How does that sound? Great. Okay, cross that one off. Sitting turns off your glutes. Once again, we could say, listen, if you sit a lot and you're pretty inactive, it makes sense that your glutes might be a little bit weaker or smaller than somebody who's more active. The solution, let's just get you up and moving more, and hey, let's train your glutes twice per week, or however often. Hey, sitting causes anterior pelvic tilt. I mean, this one is maybe a little bit more deeply ingrained, but it doesn't affect your hip extension range of motion, doesn't affect your glute strength. So you have an anterior pelvic tilt, understandable. If you want to stretch your hip flexors, understandable. Let's just train your glutes anyway. And then you always need to feel your glutes during glute-based exercises. So we can make it harder. We can change the technique, but we can also not worry too much about the sensations. And let's just train your glutes. They're going to grow and they're going to get stronger. And then the last one is like, hey, I heard that I have back pain because I have weak glutes. We can say, you know what? We don't have any definitive research to say that, but we know that just becoming more active and, creating a healthier lifestyle is good for low back pain. And as part of that program, we can do some glute training. How does that sound? Great. Let's train your glutes, right? Like, so in all of the scenarios, we're training the glutes, but we're just not making a big deal out of it.
Speaking of training the glutes, let's talk about how we can do that and some practical recommendations. And this is in the video and blog as well. You outline these 5 categories of positions and exercises that you can utilize to train all of the muscles in their different positions of the glutes. Where do you want to start? Do you want to go into just category number 1 all the way down to 5?
Yeah. So backing it up one step, I talk about 5 common training mistakes. One would be improper exercise selection. Two would be like improper technique. Three would be overemphasizing the importance of sensation. Four would be not using appropriate effort and progressive overload. And then five would be related to programming. And so for the exercise selection, I broke it up into 5 categories. So the first category is basically any exercise that involves simultaneous hip and knee extension. Squats, lunges, split squats, step ups, leg press, all of those, you have simultaneous hip and knee extension. And most of them, right, you're starting like upright, and then you're lowering yourself down, like a squat, a lunge, a split squat, a reverse lunge. Even the leg press, right, like your legs are straight, you're bending them. The only one that might be a little bit different would be the step up. You know, if you're starting with your foot on the step, then you're going to move through like the concentric portion of the movement first and then move through the eccentric. But for most of these, you're, doing the eccentric portion first. So you're lowering yourself down and then you're moving up. So that's one. The second one was just kind of deadlift and hinge variation. So this can be a conventional deadlift, single leg deadlift, Romanian deadlift, good mornings, all of that kind of stuff. The third one is bridges, hip thrusts, back extensions, and those types of variations. The fourth one is kickback variations. And then the last one is like hip abduction and external rotation variations. And so the reason I split it up this way is that most programs that have a leg day or just leg training are going to include a squat, lunge, split squat, etc. And like I said, they all have this component of simultaneous hip and knee extension, and therefore they're going to train the hip extenders, the glutes, and the knee extenders, the quads, and it doesn't necessarily matter all that much which one of those you choose. The other component of these exercises is that the glutes are working hardest in their stretched position. So at the bottom of a squat, glutes are going to be stretched, and then, they're contracting and you come back up. Okay, so there is some research that's been becoming more popular recently that shows that like training at longer muscle length, so like in a stretched position of a muscle, may contribute to greater hypertrophy outcomes than training at, let's say, a shorter muscle length. Now, we don't have that research for the glutes. So that's why I said we can't be confident in our assertions on what the best exercise or the best training modality is. But we do have some studies. So we have, Kubo et al. That shows that, squatting, a full squat leads to glute hypertrophy. We have this recent preprint, so I don't think it's actually published yet, by Plotkin et al. And this is the one where they compared hip thrust and back squat training for glute muscle hypertrophy. And, both the hip thrust and the squats contributed to hypertrophy. But that first category is, hey, we're just doing some kind of squat, deadlift, or lunge, and we're trying to go through a full range of motion. So this goes to the technique. I'm not trying to get overly complex with the technique. It's really, are you going through a good amount of hip flexion, right? So if you were to do a heels elevated kettlebell goblet squat with a very upright torso, where you're moving through a lot of knee flexion and your knees are going really far past your toes, but the load is really close to your body and you don't have much of a forward trunk lean, like that's going to be a better stimulus for your quads probably, compared to say like a low bar back squat in which you have a pretty significant trunk lean. So with the technique component for these exercises, really you're thinking about, am I going through as much like hip flexion and extension range of motion? And then, is that weight in a relative position where it's going to force my hip extenders, my glutes and my adductors to work a significant amount? So that's kind of that first technique, and then, or that first category. And that goes into that mistake of not overemphasizing the importance of sensation, because you might not feel your glutes working with every single set or every single rep. But if you're using the appropriate exercises and you're using the appropriate technique, it might not matter a significant amount. Now, I'm not saying that you can't tap into that sensation a little bit, especially if it's like a bodybuilding style training where you're trying to feel that muscle burn, or you feel the DOMs the next day. You can use that a little bit to guide your training. It's just not over emphasizing the sensation. I don't know if you want me to go into detail anymore about that squat category.
I think you nailed it. Let's go into the hinge deadlift variation category.
Yeah. So and I will say, so for the squat category, people do this, and I'm going to generalize here, because they want to grow both their quads, their knee extensors, and like their glutes, the hip extensors. And like I said, you also get growth of the adductors. And sometimes with quads and lunges and split squats and those types of exercises, the quads will fatigue prior to, let's say, the glutes. So you might not be necessarily reaching failure or as close to failure as we might want to maximize hypertrophy. So once again, there's another recent paper that came out that shows like, hey, training closer to failure is probably better for hypertrophy. Now, we can't, leap too far with this. Like, we still have to consider volume and other aspects of it. But something to think about with the deadlifts and the hinge variations. Now, this focus is going to be glutes and hamstrings. So once again, you're working the glutes in their stretched position. So the goal is, hey, let's try to move through as much hip flexion, range of motion as possible relatively, but this time you're going to be moving, from the trunk first. And you'll be working your glutes and your hamstrings. If you're doing like, let's say, an RDL type variation, probably keeping, and the goal was to work the glutes, you probably want to keep a little bit more of a knee bend, so that you're not limited by your hamstrings. Either way, it's not bad. But if you have a specific goal, like, hey, I really want to get a stretch in my hamstrings, I want to work my hamstrings more, you probably want to do a stiffer leg deadlift. I know for me, like a single leg deadlift, I don't think anything gets my glutes, maybe like a barbell rear foot elevated split squat, but like a single leg deadlift, really gets my glutes pretty sore the next day or the next couple of days. And I talk about too, with both, like, let's say, reverse lunges or single leg deadlifts, you can try to add a little bit of a rotation component. So some people might think of like a curtsy lunge. I don't know if you have to go that exaggerated where you step back and across your midline. But, if we think about the glutes contributing to relative hip extension, abduction, and external rotation, you could, rotate your torso a bit so that at the bottom of the movement, your hip is flexed, internally rotated, and adducted, and then you move out of that. So that's a deadlift and the hinge variation. Once again, maybe the one like downside of that is that maybe your low back fatigues first or your hamstrings fatigue first, if your goal is purely glute hypertrophy. The third category, the bridges, the hip thrusts, the back extensions, these all train the glutes. And I keep saying the glutes, but like the glute max in its shortened position where it has the best leverage, right? So like when you do a hip thrust, you're working the hardest when your hips are lifted up toward the ceiling or the sky, and you're contracting those glutes in the maximally shortened position. So, that recent paper showed that hip thrusts and back squats elicit similar hypertrophy between the two. But we need to take it one step further to figure out, why were there limitations? We don't necessarily know. There was another study by Cassiano that added hip thrust to leg press and stiff-legged deadlifts. And the group that added the barbell hip thrust grew their glutes more, but they didn't account for the extra volume, right? So it's like one group is doing 2 exercises, one group is doing 3 exercises. You would imagine that the group doing 3 exercises is going to grow more. We don't necessarily know if it was the hip thrust or just the added volume, right? So maybe they could have just done another set of deadlifts, another set of leg press, and they would have grew just as much. But like my goal with describing these categories is let's try to be as comprehensive as possible. and make sure that we cover all of our bases. And there's going to be some redundancy here. There's redundancy in a lot of training. People will go to the gym and do, 5 different pushing exercises on their like chest day, or they'll go and do legs and they'll do a squat, a leg press, a split squat, a rear foot elevated split squat, and they're all, training similar muscle groups. But so squats and deadlift and hinge variations, they kind of train the glute max in the stretch position. The bridges, the hip thrust, the back extensions, train it in the shortened position. And just like the squats and the deadlifts, like the bridges and hip thrusts, you will grow other muscles too. So it's not like an isolation exercise just for the glutes, like other muscles are working. The next category, I put like the kickback variations. And this would be like, you put a cable column strap like around your ankle and you do a kickback, or maybe you do like a donkey kickback machine. Now, these could train the glute max in the lengthened or shortened position, depending on the type of resistance that you're using, the range of motion that you're working through. So this is also redundant. The reason I added this one is that I think of these as a little bit more of like isolation exercises. And so, maybe they are less fatiguing than like a barbell back squat. Like I could probably do way more kickbacks than I can, barbell back squats. Or if somebody doesn't want to, for whatever reason, grow their hamstrings or their quads as much, then, they could throw in some more of these like kickback variations. So that's the 4th category. And then the last one, just like a hip abduction and or external rotation variations, is because that study by Plotkin et al., when they assessed the hypertrophy of the glutes, 2 things happened. One, the upper glute max didn't grow as much as the lower glute max, and the upper glute max likely contributes more to like hip abduction and external rotation. And they didn't have that in their study. It was just hip thrust and back squats, so just like this linear hip extension motion. And then like the glute medius and the glute minimus didn't grow. So it just kind of shows that if your goal was, total growth and strength, you probably need to add in some of those like hip abduction and or external rotation variations. And you could do any number of things, whether it's with the band, whether it's with inside line, whether it's with a cable column. And once again, this is one of those things that I don't know if we know exactly which plane of motion is the best. And this could be where you play with it a little bit and you do tap into the sensations a little bit. That's okay. It's just making sure that you're getting that big picture of, am I working the appropriate plane of motion? And then, really when it comes down to the other 2 training mistakes, appropriate effort and progressive overload, and then programming, I think a mistake that a lot of people make is that, they'll do these like banded exercises for 20 reps, 30 reps, or however many reps. And they're probably just not pushing hard enough and progressing over time. There's a difference between like volitional failure where you feel a burn and then you just stop the exercise versus true momentary muscular failure where, let's say you're doing a barbell back squat, you're doing a 3-rep max, and on that 3rd rep, you collapse and the safety bars save you because you couldn't have done another repetition versus, you do 10 repetitions and you just stop because your legs burn, but you could have done another 3 repetitions. So just making sure that like you can use the bands and you can use light weights and you can do high reps, but if really pushing hard and probably doing some lower rep sets in there, like 6 reps, 7 reps, 8 reps, not always just doing 25 reps, 30 reps, and then making sure that you're doing more over time, and then the last thing is programming. So this is probably the most variable thing, just depending on your current fitness level, your goals. If you're training 2 days per week versus 3 days per week, but once again, probably doing less than what you think you need, really trying to tap into that as much as possible, like squeeze every ounce out of those exercises and sets that you're doing on those 2 days per week or 3 days per week. And then once that stalls or stagnates, then you can add in another set or you can add in another exercise. But I think the idea is always doing more versus just scaling back, doing less to start. And then once you plateau, you have a lot of levers to pull versus if you're already kind of maxed out with your exercises and your sets and what you're doing in the gym, sometimes that can leave you unsure of where to go next with your programming.
Were your glutes sore after filming all the exercises for this video?
Yes.
I
I
bet.
don't do that much hip abduction work. I've been trying to include it a little bit more, but things that I find more fun, I would maybe say, like I don't go to the cable column and do like hip abduction on the cable column, but I've been playing with like an elevated single leg hip abduction thing. So just imagine if you were on the floor, you're doing a side plank, you lift the top leg, and we did this. You lift the top leg, so you're just supported by the bottom leg, and then you tap your hip to the floor and you lift back up. So it's like a weight bearing hip abduction. And I've been playing with that with my forearm and leg elevated. So like, let's say you put your forearm on one bench and your leg on the other bench. And then that way you can just go through more range of motion because you're not limited by the floor. And that's, also like a bit of an oblique exercise. Yeah. But I was sore.
Yeah, that was brutal. We had a little circuit action going, and you had us do rear foot elevate split squats and then go into those. I was flopping away. I've been going ham on the seated abduction, just way easier to like constrain that movement because you're just stuck in the machine.
And you'll see different camps here. And this is what I mean is that someone like Brett Contreras loves the seated hip abduction. And then there's another camp that says like, well, actually, it's not the best movement for the glute max based on the line of pull of the glute max. And this is where you can experiment a little bit, and you might have two exercises for hip abduction. Maybe one of them is seated hip abduction. Maybe one of them is something else, or maybe you don't feel the soreness, or maybe your glutes aren't growing. Like, it's okay. But I have a hard time saying like, for sure, this exercise won't work or this exercise will work. If you're using, generally appropriate reasoning, it's probably fine until we actually have a study that says, okay, let's measure seated hip abduction versus cable hip abduction over the course of 8 weeks and which one, grows the glutes more. It's hard to be very definitive and confident in an answer.
Did you ever do that thing where you laid on your stomach and someone rolled the barbell over you to see if your glutes were big enough to where it wouldn't fit?
Yeah.
Same.
I think mine would hit, but I don't think I have like ginormous glutes, but yeah, I think it would hit.
Yeah, you got enough meat back there for sure. What else? Anything you feel like we didn't cover?
No, it's a lot. I realize that on paper, like I just made like notes to myself in terms of making sure that I covered the 5 mistakes and the categories of exercises. But man, this could have been like a 3-hour podcast, right? Like trying to describe all of the exercises, the intricacies of technique. And once again, like I don't get too caught up in the technique. Like you're doing a deadlift, go through hip flexion, slight bend in your knees, low back relatively flat. You'll be okay. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about. Hopefully I think the video is going to be pretty long. It'll probably be like 15, 20 minutes. And then hopefully with those visuals, will help as well. And obviously all of the research will pop up on screen, or if you read the blog, you can read that research.
What, out of all the videos you filmed, which muscle group has been the most sore post-filming?
The most sore? That's a good question. I would have to think it's a calf video. Actually, no. The tennis elbow one was pretty rough. Like doing those little like finger extension. Like my forearm was super sore. Obviously, I've like given myself some hip pain, from doing a lot of filming. I've probably given myself like more pain than soreness, I would imagine. Like just doing a ton of exercises that I'm not used to. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. I think that's a great place to stop. Big summaries. There's a lot of misconceptions that probably aren't that valuable to hold. It's still super valuable to train the glutes in a variety of positions with sufficient volume, frequency, load. You don't have to get super specific with it, with cueing. And as long as you achieve the big rocks, check a lot of boxes, you're probably rock and rolling.
Yeah. And I will say that I try to challenge my biases. Like, I went on Twitter and I asked people, hey, give me research or rationale for why gluteal amnesia is a thing and why we should care. And I couldn't get anything. And I went scouring the internet, I went scouring blogs and research, and beyond what we just said, I couldn't find anything to support why we would use that description, despite looking. So, like, I'm not here just to, spew the gospel of E3 rehab. Like, I'm looking for differences of opinion that I can consider when we have these discussions, but there was just nothing there for gluteal amnesia.
All right, we'll call it there.